Support for WABE comes from Capital Good Fund, introducing Georgia Bright Solar Lease Program, a new rooftop solar initiative designed to create pathways to equitable and inclusive solar, sustainability, and monthly savings for Georgians. Learn more at georgiabright.org.
At a time when information continues to come at us faster and faster, sometimes you need to hit pause and rewind. NPR's Throughline takes you back in time to the source of the news stories filling your feed. Find NPR's Throughline wherever you get your podcasts.
It's Senate Bill 496, and it has been changed in committee yesterday to include House Bill 1116, House Bill 1134, and House Bill 97.
Christmas trees, Frankenstein, zombies, vehicles, call them what you like. It's that time of year. With just a few days to go, lawmakers are jamming through bills any way they can.
Republicans have taken over a bill on mental health for student athletes and stuffed it with measures on school bathrooms, sex education, and library books.
And they've taken a slim bill on ballot watermarks and made it into an omnibus package. Republicans say it puts guardrails on mass voter challenges. Democrats say it emboldens them.
This program will now be used to justify and fuel those mass voter challenges even more.
Plus, an AI lawmaker makes the pitch for a bill the real-life senator is vehemently against.
Luckily, by the power of AI, I am here to speak in favor of a Republican bill.
And the wrongly convicted lobby lawmakers to compensate them for their decades in prison.
It's only right. 25 years of my life is gone. I can't get that back. I've missed so much stuff. I don't have kids. I don't have anything out here.
With a week to go in the legislative session, we'll guide you through the final days of lawmaking.
And later, we'll catch up with WABE's environmental team, Emily Jones and Marisa Mecke.
I'm WABE politics reporter Sam Gringlas.
I'm politics reporter Rahul Bali. It's week 11 of the Georgia General Assembly.
And this is Dome Scramble, a pop-up podcast about the legislature and more from WABE News in Atlanta.
Well, Sam, we're not in one of my favorite places outside of the Capitol. We had to move because the blood drive is happening over where I normally like to sit on the Capitol steps. So we've got a new spot this week.
Okay, yes, we are in a different spot this week, but we have the pleasure of sitting in the shadow of former Governor Ellis Gibbs Arnold, who was governor from 1943 to 1947 and whose statue now graces the lawn of the Capitol.
And anybody who ever takes the tour of WABE radio, what you'll notice on my desk is a bunch of campaign pins, and actually one of the campaign pins I have is his. And it also makes me wonder if as governor, he had to deal with Frankenstein bills and bills with things that are all slammed together, Christmas trees. You know, when we use that term, what we're referring to are lawmakers shoving unpassed measures into bills that did actually cross over before the crossover deadline day at the end of February. So this is, a big challenge for us as reporters, because we're trying to figure out, hey, what bill are we supposed to follow? Where's the language of a bill we're following? It's also frustrating for Democrats and even some Republicans who are, like us, trying to figure out what's in a certain bill and what's being presented. So, Sam, you've been covering a few of these.
Yeah, so let me start with a bill that seemed to pack a bunch of culture war issues that touch on schools all into one. The original bill, HB 1104, sponsored by Democratic Representative Amari Crawford, focused only on providing mental health resources for student athletes. Seems pretty anodyne, right? Well, then Senate Republicans took it and stuffed it with a whole bunch more. One section prohibits sex education before the 6th grade, and it also adds a litany of reporting requirements when a district approves sex ed curriculum. Democratic Senator Elena Parent called that ironic.
Can you please explain why it's okay for us to operate in such a manner to attach 5 different bills and not let the public know and not vet them, but these school systems were requiring on a full page of code that they adhere to a completely different standard?
Republican Senator Clint Dixon said several of the measures now wrapped up in this bill had already individually passed the committee. And he defended a provision allowing teachers to discuss menstruation but not sex. I just want to listen to a little taste of what this debate sounded like.
And I'm not a woman, but I did stay at a Holiday Inn Express once. So, but what I would say to the reproductive organ part of it or whatnot, I don't think that would align with sex education.
The bill would also require parents to be notified about books their kids check out at the library. It also prohibits transgender kids from using the bathroom that matches their gender identity and furthers a 2022 law we covered that paved the way for blocking trans kids from school sports.
And whether it's this bill or some of the other combined bills on immigration or anything else, the danger is lawmakers could like some of what's in the bill, but not other parts. Lawmakers would have to make a decision whether they wanted, this bill to pass or that bill to pass or not pass at all. There's also the danger of the governor vetoing a whole bill over a single section. Now, when it comes to these discussions on what's going to be voted for or not voted for, we're seeing that happen with a controversial package of election bills this week, which, is leading into the run-up to the 2024 election, Sam.
Yeah, that's right. HB 976 is among several election bills I'm following this session, and this one makes a number of changes, but let's talk about the core of this legislation, and that deals with individuals' ability to challenge the eligibility of an unlimited number of voters. In recent years, election integrity skeptics have challenged tens of thousands of voters at once. Most are tossed out. Republicans say with this bill, they're just establishing some guardrails by codifying some specific reasons for sustaining a voter challenge, like someone voting or claiming a homestead exemption in another state. But Democrats say this further emboldens individuals who file these challenges regularly. This was the response from Republican Senate Majority Leader Steve Gooch.
Tell me why you would be concerned about anybody challenging someone's eligibility to vote. If someone challenged my eligibility to vote in Lumpkin County, I'd be happy to provide documentation.
Democrats, of course, push back on that, noting that these challenges overload overworked election offices and can trip up voters who need to defend their residency. Now, the bill does include some new limitations that could curb these challenges, at least in some ways. It would put challenges on hold 45 days prior to an election, and it clarifies that information in the National Change of Address database, which can be kind of unreliable, are not enough alone to sustain a challenge. However, Republicans knocked down a Democratic proposal that would have imposed charges for people who file more than 500 of these challenges in a year, ostensibly because it wasn't clear how much those costs would be, but also because this would have been a change that would have been really unpopular with these people who are regularly filing these voting challenges. Rahul, this week you've been covering long-awaited efforts to change how the wrongfully convicted are compensated in Georgia, and you actually spoke to someone who has experienced this firsthand. Tell me a little bit about what you learned.
Sam, we talk a lot about what happens here at the legislature affects you, me, our fellow Georgians. This is the most direct example of this. Over the past month, I've had conversations with two men, Lee Clark and Joey Watkins, both from Northwest Georgia, both wrongfully convicted in completely separate cases. And get this, they met at Phillips State Prison in Beaufort in 2001, 23 years ago. Here's Lee talking about that.
We became good friends. We got to talking, and turns out me and him had a lot of stuff in common. A lot of the same people that were in play, same situation with his, same attorney. I mean, I keep going on and on. So many things there, but yeah, we developed a strong friendship. Joey's like my brother.
So both were eventually exonerated, which brings us to now. How do you compensate these two men? Clark, 25 years in prison, Watkins, 22 years in prison. And here was what was in the compensation resolution. Giving these men, one of them, Clark, $1.8 million, the other, Watkins, $1.6 million. And here's what that translates to. They're basically being compensated $72,000 a year for each year they were in prison. That's $197 a day. It's just one of those, you sit and think about those numbers of, if my freedom was taken away, this is what they're going to pay me. And you heard that in the show open, how deeply emotional Lee was about, this is only fair for the time he put in prison for a crime he never committed.
Okay, so turn me back to the legislature. This becomes a policy debate. How is that unfolding here at the Capitol?
So that is the other part of the story. In Georgia, compensation for wrongfully convicted people is actually handled as a piece of legislation, like any other bill or resolution, which means it can get caught up in the same issues, politics, trading between the House and Senate, lawmakers or chair members who don't like a piece of legislation. All of those challenges that can come with legislation. And you know what? Lee, one of the two people that I've been interviewing, he was just deeply frustrated by this.
There should be a committee in place here in Georgia where if a man is wrongfully convicted, or a woman, either one being, and they get out of prison, you should automatically compensate them people when they get out. They shouldn't have to go through all this that they have to go through to get compensated. You could eliminate this whole process, and it'd be better for everybody.
It's important to mention that House Bill 364 by Democratic State House Representative Scott Holcomb would create the Wrongful Conviction Compensation Review Panel to replace the current process. After spending another day here at the Capitol, Lee told me that meeting with lawmakers he used the word, felt like being in a blender. But Sam, unfortunately, we don't have a happy ending to this story. The Senate Appropriations Committee met today, probably for the last time this session, and they did not take up the compensation resolutions for either man. Before this final decision, I asked Joey Watkins about the possibility of his resolution failing and having to wait another year.
I guess it would change the trajectory of my life as far as my future plans. But if it happens, there's nothing I can do. We've done all we can do. I'm hoping and praying that it happens, but if it doesn't, I'll keep pushing.
And a little more of what Joey told me, his hope for that money was to open a car dealership like his dad. That was what he was hoping to use, what would have been $1.6 million to do.
That little detail just humanizes what we're talking about here in such a visceral way.
You're right, Sam. I've been talking to these guys ever since their compensation resolutions came out of the House and headed over to the Senate. Sam, I wanted to shift gears and really talk about something that was a water cooler conversation everyone was talking about this week. The voice of a lawmaker generated by artificial intelligence testifying in a committee this week. You've got to tell everyone about this.
Okay, so Republican Senator Colton Moore has been a vocal opponent of HB 986. But then the sound of Moore's voice blared over the committee room speakers to testify in favor of it.
If AI can be used to make Colton Moore speak in favor of a popular piece of legislation, it can be used to make any one of you say things you've never said.
I got to be very honest, Sam. Even though I've been hearing about this, I decided not to listen to it till just now. And that is completely crazy, especially as someone in the Senate. I sit directly behind Senator Moore. That is just crazy.
So, Rahul, what this is what's known as a deep fake. It was crafted by the sponsors of the bill to show just how easy it is to manipulate media for nefarious purposes. This bill would criminalize broadcasting, publishing, or streaming deceptive images, video, or recordings, known as these deep fakes, to create confusion around an election or to influence its outcome. Opponents like the real Colton Moore cite free speech concerns. I should note, though, that this bill would only apply 90 days before an election to people affiliated with a political party, campaign, or committee. But I think this just underscores this new frontier of election threats that we're going to have to follow in the years to come. Okay, Rahul, we are at the finish line almost. Sine die, the end of the session is a few days from now. I've just talked about a couple of bills that still have miles to go before they become law. Some of these election bills, some of the culture war topics like the schools bill we just talked about, but also measures to ban puberty blockers for young people experiencing gender dysphoria, a religious liberty bill that's quite controversial. Rahul, beyond these measures, lightning round, anything else you're watching going into next week that you genuinely have no idea if it'll cross the finish line ban or not.
So let's go by topic, Sam. Let's start with gambling. And I'm hearing that legalizing sports betting is in trouble. Here's the issue. The proposals, Senate Bill 386 and Senate Resolution 579, include a constitutional amendment that has to be approved by Georgia voters. But it also means that the Senate and the House need 2/3 majority to pass it. And I'm hearing they're having a real problem in the House getting to that number. A couple other bills and things I do want to mention. Film tax credit got out of a Senate committee. Some key changes were made, giving exemptions to really big studios when it comes to transferring and selling their tax credits. So really a big change to that bill. Otherwise, the big thing is studios are going to have to do more in Georgia, more vendors, more Georgia employees to get the full tax break. Housing. House Bill 404 passed the Senate today. It does need to go back to the House. Has a couple of key things in that legislation. Your security deposit for your apartment or your home can only be 2 months worth of rent. The house has to be habitable. Now, a couple of people have been asking me, who gets to define that? That gets defined by your local government. On what is considered a habitable house to live in. And then the last thing is, if you're late on your rent, you have 3 days to make good. They give you a full notice, and then you get 3 more days to make good on whether it's late fees or your rent. State budget got out of the Senate Appropriations Committee. This is the 2025 budget that starts on July the 1st. It includes the $2,500 pay raise for public K-12 teachers and staff, along with a 4% cost of living adjustment for all state and university employees. The $36 billion budget now goes to the full Senate for a vote. The last thing I want to talk about is immigration legislation. We've had some great reporting by our Emily Wu Pearson. She is trying to keep track of nearly 24 bills, but I want to talk about one that I'm starting to hear more and more about. This is House Bill 1105, which requires local law enforcement to work with federal authorities when there's the possibility that a suspect is in the country illegally. What I'm hearing now around the Capitol is concerns from law enforcement on how much this is going to cost to implement and the resources. The word I keep hearing, unfunded mandate. That's kind of the concern that's going around the Capitol, something that's going to have to be worked on. That's my lightning round on 5 things that I'm following.
And this is a good moment to remind our listeners that you can follow many of the bills we're tracking by visiting our bill tracker at wabe.org/2024 bill tracker. Let's take a break here. This is Dome Scramble from WABE.
The field of mental health counseling is growing rapidly, and Richmont Graduate University can equip you with everything you need as a licensed professional counselor while integrating your faith into your clinical practice. Programs are offered in Atlanta, Chattanooga, and online. Apply today at richmont.edu. That's richmont.edu.
You love free, and at Ameris Bank, so do we. That's why we're proud to offer worry-free, hassle-free Ameris Bank free checking. Manage your money your way with convenient access to digital, mobile, and telephone banking, all with no monthly service fee or minimum balance requirements. At Ameris Bank, we're with you. For more information or to open an account, visit our local bankers in person or online at amerisbank.com/free checking. Other fees such as overdraft fees may apply. Ameris Bank, member FDIC, equal housing lender.
Welcome back to Dome Scramble. WABE is lucky enough to have not one, but 2 reporters who cover the environment. Emily Jones covers the climate for WABE and our partner Grist, and Marisa Mecke covers the environment for WABE. Welcome to the show.
Hey. Hey, thanks for having us.
Okay, you guys both get to go to some really cool places on your beat, and I'd love for each of you to tell me maybe the most surprising or interesting place that your reporting has taken you.
Okay, so the coolest place I think that I've gotten to go was several miles offshore in the ocean with the scientists who keep tabs on endangered right whales. So I've been covering the plight of the right whales for a decade at this point, but it's so rare to actually get to see one of them. Because there's only a couple hundred left in the whole world. There are fewer than 360 North Atlantic right whales left. And it is, for that reason, illegal to get too close to them and bother them. So if you're ever out in the ocean normally, if you're on a fishing boat or whatever, and you see a fin or you see them breathe from their blowhole, you have to like turn around and leave immediately. But because I was with the whale researchers, I got to actually watch some of the mother whales swim around with their new babies, like, and the babies are like splashing around their mom's heads, and we were so close to them, and honestly, it felt miraculous. It was unbelievable.
Yeah, and I'm still relatively new to WABE, and I haven't done like a full summer season here yet, which is when most of our researchers are really active. So one of my like coolest memories was when I was still reporting on the coast. I was in Savannah for the Gannett USA Today network, and I spent a night on Wausau Island, which is one of the Georgia barrier islands, but the Coretta Research Project, which monitors for nesting sea turtles. And there were so many turtles that were nesting that night that they, had me getting in there, logging data, and helping move like new eggs that were too close to the water and would get drowned when the tide came in. And, the turtle life and reproduction cycles are so long. These turtles are returning after decades, and we're just now seeing record numbers of nests thanks to like the big steps in conservation that were in the late 80s and early 90s. And it's just so humbling to report on and be witness to and, be part of such like a long legacy of Georgia turtles.
I love that we have turtles and whales on our podcast. Let me turn to the alligators and travel to the Okefenokee Swamp, which is being considered for designation as a World Heritage Site. There's a proposal right now to build a mine near the swamp, and advocates for the swamp have pressed for bills in the legislature to protect this ecosystem. But before we get to all that, can you just describe why the Okie is such a jewel in Georgia and in the nation?
That is so hard to put into words, but I'm going to try. So first, some facts about it. If you're not familiar, the Okefenokee Swamp is this vast wilderness in southeast Georgia. I mean, it's huge. It takes hours just to drive around it from one side to the other. It has miles and miles of still, dark water and trees that stretch up into the sky. It's the largest, most intact ecosystem of its kind. And it's also a certified dark sky site, which means it's one of those rare places on Earth where at nighttime you can look up and you don't just see a few stars, you can actually see the Milky Way. And it's also home to all sorts of endangered species. I mean, you mentioned alligators, which have actually been a huge species recovery success. But there are tons of endangered and threatened species in there. There's the red cockaded woodpecker, the gopher tortoise, other species like that. But I also don't feel like any of that really captures what feels so special about the Okefenokee when you go there. I actually did a story last year about the spiritual connections that people feel to the Okefenokee, because it really does inspire this almost religious feelings for a lot of people. It's been both from a practical standpoint in terms of resources, but also spiritually important to people for thousands of years. The Muskogee Creek people lived there and considered it sacred long before European settlers got here. And I've also talked with pastors today who feel like it's a special place where they can see and feel God's creation. I've talked with city kids who told me that they went to the Okefenokee and it was the first place where they ever really felt and like got a connection to nature, all of which is to say it's just a really unique place. And for a lot of people who visit the Okefenokee, it really inspires deep, deep feelings.
Okay, so then what's the issue here? So why is this ecosystem even being threatened? And then bring it back here to where we're sitting at the state capitol. What's happening legislatively to protect those ecosystems?
Great questions. So for background, in 2019, an Alabama-based company called Twin Pines Minerals kind of put in their bid that they wanted to build a mine near the edge of the Okefenokee Swamp on what's called Trail Ridge, which is this ancient sand dune formation on the eastern side of the National Wildlife Refuge. And the problem is that there's a big scientific kind of schism about whether or not the mine is going to hurt the Okefenokee Swamp. The Georgia Environmental Protection Division has held throughout this entire process that they think that it's not actually going to threaten the ecosystem. However, pretty much every other scientist and expert who has opined on the issue totally disagrees. They argue that the mine itself would degrade the environment, but they also have big problems with how the EPD has gone about doing these scientific analyses and argue that they're totally wrong. So earlier this month, the Georgia EPD hosted a public comments on a permit that's kind of a portion of all these larger permits they have to get done. And one of the people who commented was Michael Lusk, and he's the refuge manager of the Okefenokee National Wildlife Refuge. And this is really significant because he was actually speaking on behalf of the whole U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which has been outspoken against the mine for the entirety of the process and really is one of the only and largest government entities that has spoken against the EPD.
Dr. Ed Jackson from the University of Georgia has concluded that the proposed mining will result in a threefold increase in frequency and duration of drought in the southeastern quadrant of the swamp.
Lusk goes on to say that beyond habitat loss and degradation, this could dramatically increase wildfire potential in the swamp.
Okay, so we're talking about potential threats to the swamp from the construction of this mine, but how does all this intersect with the legislature?
This is the number one thing that listeners ask me about. And so for the last couple of years, this has been one of the hottest topics for everybody who works on Capitol Hill in Georgia related to the environment. The main piece of legislation for protecting the Okefenokee swamp has been House Bill 71, which was proposed by or sponsored by Representative Darlene Taylor from Thomasville. And this bill was introduced in 2023 and assigned to the House Natural Resources Committee, but that's where it got stuck. It didn't end up going anywhere. It picked back up again this year, but by crossover day, it was still stuck in the House Natural Resources Committee. And when we say stuck, we mean that the committee chair, Representative Lynn Smith, hasn't scheduled it for the committee to vote for it to move on. And the bill in general is looking to limit mining activities in the area around where the current company is looking to mine to prevent future expansion and future mining. This bill, it has 96 sponsors, which a lot of people have pointed out is enough for it to pass the House if all the co-signers voted yes. It's been really popular among constituents, and to a lot of voters, this seems like a quintessential moment of something broken in the political system. Constituents and their representatives seem to popularly agree that they want a bill to protect the Okefenokee swamp, but the legislation still can't get passed. But just before crossover day this year, a new Okefenokee bill meant to work in the realm of protection cropped up in the House as well, and that was HB 1338, sponsored by Representative John Corbett. And that one, if passed, would ban Twin Pines Minerals from expanding its project in the next 3 years. But environmentalists and critics were really quick to point out that this might not really mean very much because they would have to go through this whole permitting process again, which let's, remind ourselves that we're already 5 years into the permitting process for the current mine. So a 3-year moratorium really might not do all that much. And so it faced a lot of stark opposition from environmental advocates, and it also ended up not going anywhere. But it's worth noting that this was introduced right before crossover day, and it was assigned, heard by a committee, and passed through a committee, all probably within 3 days or so. So it made a lot more progress in a couple days than HB 71 did the whole time it was in the legislature for 23 to 24. Hey y'all, this is Marisa from the future. So a couple hours after we recorded this podcast, there was actually some breaking news about these bills, so we're going to slide in a quick update about what happened today. So remember, House Bill 71 and House Bill 1338 didn't cross over, so they did not get to become legislation. But we're in that time of the session where stuff can come back in all sorts of weird ways, and that's what happened today with House Bill 1338. So Representative James Burchett, who's a Republican of Waycross, introduced a bill that's meant to be a compromise when it comes to this question of a moratorium. Here's what he came up with. His bill would create a moratorium similar to the one in 1338, this 3-year moratorium on permitting a new mine in that eastern part of the Okefenokee swamp at Trail Ridge. But what his new measure would also do is place limits on the length of time that judges would have in the situation to decide challenges to the permit decisions from the Georgia Environmental Protection Division. That being said, this doesn't really circumvent the main concerns that environmental advocates had with House Bill 1338. So we'll just have to see where this one goes from here. Back to the show.
So I want to shift gears, and in shifting gears, I know y'all are going to groan. I want to talk about one of my favorite topics and something you guys cover all the time, the PSC, the PSC elections, or the lack of PSC elections, has been nothing more than just a hot mess. Before we get into all of that, Emily, explain to our audience what is the PSC and why is it important for those of us who live here in Georgia?
Listen, I'm never going to groan. This is literally my favorite thing to do, is to try to explain to people what the PSC is and why they should care about it. So the Public Service Commission regulates just about everything that Georgia Power does. So they set the rates that people pay for electricity. They also approve how that electricity gets made. So for the 2.7 million customers who get their electricity from Georgia Power, the PSC has an enormous amount of power over their monthly energy bills. And because the PSC decides how electricity gets made for all of those customers, they also have a really big impact on emissions that contribute to climate change.
So let's explain to the audience how we've gotten to this point where we have not had Public Service Commission elections, and we're not going to have them this year.
Right. So that comes back to how these elections are set up, which is pretty unusual. There are 5 districts, and each of the commissioners has to live in their district, but the elections are statewide. So, for instance, I live in Savannah, but I can still vote for the commissioner from Atlanta and the one from South Georgia and so on, because all of the elections are statewide. So the original idea here when this system was set up in the late 90s was to kind of balance the state level commission with the local impacts that its decisions can have. But a couple years ago, a group of Black voters from Atlanta sued because they say that this system dilutes their votes and thereby violates the Voting Rights Act. So the elections are essentially just on hold while that lawsuit works its way through the courts. That's taking a really long time. So back in 2022, a federal judge agreed with those plaintiffs and ordered that 2 PSC elections that were scheduled that year actually had to be paused until the state could come up with a new system. Then the Secretary of State appealed. It took almost a year, but the appeals court ultimately reversed that decision and said that the elections could happen. But that court still hasn't issued their final guidance. And of course, the plaintiffs could also appeal again. But in the meantime, without that final guidance from the court, the Secretary of State's office says that they can't hold an election until they have those orders from the judge in their hands. So in the meantime, those 2 commissioners who would have been on the ballot in 2022 continue to serve and continue to vote. And there's actually now a 3rd commissioner whose term expires at the end of this year. And there's still no election scheduled. Those elections remain in limbo.
So this seems like a total hot mess. I mean, what's being done to get these elections scheduled at some point? You can't just keep seats in limbo indefinitely. What's being done here?
Well, there is now an effort in the legislature to get the elections going again. There's a substitute bill coming from the Senate that says all the current commissioners would serve until their replacements are elected. And then it also lays out a schedule for those elections starting next year. But a lot of the consumer and the environment advocates who deal with the PSC they're pretty iffy on this bill. The current commissioners would end up with some really extra long terms. So for one example, the District 2 Commissioner, Tim Echols, would have served a 9-year term by the time of the election that this bill calls for next year. And District 5 Commissioner Tricia Pridemore would serve 8 years before facing re-election in 2026 under this bill. And just keep in mind, these are usually 6-year terms. So that's a long extension of their terms. Although it's also worth noting that Echols, as well as District 3 Commissioner Fitz Johnson, are already in their 2nd year past their original election date.
Oof, that's a lot to take in. But now, Marisa, I'm grabbing my imaginary kayak and I want to turn to you for some legislation that you've been following. And it looks at how Georgians fish and paddle on rivers when access conflicts with private property rights. The bodies of water in question here, they're called navigable rivers. What are those and what exactly is the conflict here?
Yeah, this has been a huge hot topic for imaginary kayakers, real kayakers, and especially people who like fishing in Georgia. Navigable waters is this really wonky, like old-time definition for waterways in Georgia that essentially means rivers that are big enough to float a boat that is loaded with cargo. So if that gives you an idea of how old of a definition we're talking about.
I'm picturing like fur traders with their wares and their pots and pans and stuff like that.
Yeah, that is exactly how old we're talking. So this term is really referring to Georgia's bigger rivers, not really necessarily the smaller streams. That being said, there's kind of 3 bills floating around about this, and I will give you a taste into one of them. One of them is actually just trying to list what the navigable rivers in Georgia are. We actually don't legally have a list of those. So if that gives you an idea of what uncharted waters we're in right now. So the big question when it comes to navigable rivers is who controls the rivers? You know, it's a bit wonky, but it boils down to landowners who want to assert that they can say who fish and paddles on their properties. Since there are many landowners who own the riverbeds under these, quote, navigable waters up to the halfway point of a river. So while people can't really own rivers, they can own the riverbed underneath a river. On the opposite side, there's fishers, paddlers, and many in the outdoor communities in Georgia who argue that it's the right of Georgians to be able to recreate, fish, and paddle the state's rivers and move freely through them. And so that's kind of the crux of this debate. And so last year in 2023, at the very, very end of the legislative session, a lawsuit was decided. It was on the Flint River. Some landowners together, so a family that owns land, sued the state saying that they want to prevent people from fishing on their property at the Flint River in this really popular fishing spot called Yellow Jacket Shoals, which is popular for shoal bass, which is, you know, a sport fish. And that lawsuit was decided in their favor a couple days before the legislative session ended. And then there was a really, really quick piece of legislation that went through the Senate that was meant to guarantee Georgians' rights to fish and paddle. However, there was a lot of backlash against that because property owners thought that that was a bit overreaching and was going to infringe on personal property rights. And so now there are bills swirling through the legislature that are trying to figure out how to reconcile personal property rights and people's rights to recreate in rivers. There are 2 bills that are very, very similar trying to address that question and thread that fine needle, one in the Senate and one in the House. Environmental advocates are in favor of the one in the Senate because it specifies that they are allowed to touch the bottom of the river wherever they are in the river, and the House bill does not. And that is how of granular detail we are getting on this. And right now, neither of those have passed. And the third one, the aforementioned list of navigable rivers, did not make it past crossover day. So far, we have these really, really big questions about who can use rivers, but we haven't really kind of figured out where we're going to land on them. And so that's the issue with navigable rivers. So TLDR, 3 bills. The list did not pass crossover day. The Senate bill, environmentalists prefer, but has not been moving all that much. And the House bill seems to be more on the move, but also has not gotten past its reading in the Senate after crossing over.
All right, I have a big picture question for both of you. You know, we cover the politics of environment and climate change often, and I think, you know, especially with climate change, there's been some maybe change of heart from Republicans on this topic as they begin to personally experience the effects of a changing climate, you know, whether it's on their farm or on their coast. And I wonder if maybe you all can give some examples of, you know, how that might shape policy debates to come.
Yeah, I mean, I sat in a House committee hearing earlier this week on Tuesday morning, right after it had suddenly gotten super, super cold. And I listened to a bunch of representatives before they started discussing bills give reports on their crops back home and how they had fared in that cold snap. And obviously a March cold snap is nothing unusual, but they have been causing problems lately because when it's super warm in January and February, things start to flower. And then a cold snap like this can be absolutely devastating. I mean, that's what happened to the peach crop last year. So that's the kind of evidence I think that you're talking about that's really tangible and people just can't deny it. They see it themselves. They feel it in their pocketbook. I also see a similar phenomenon often here on the coast where people can very clearly see, you know, the high tide used to only come up so far and now it's washing over my dock. It's flooding my yard. You can't deny there's been a change there. I think as far as policy, it's important that lawmakers and regulators like the commissioners at the PSC, other folks in power, that are seeing these climate impacts, really make the connection between what's happening to their crops and what's happening to the sea level and the emissions that come from power plants and cars and trucks and factories and all of the sources of greenhouse gas emissions. Scientists have proven that connection. There isn't scientific doubt about that connection, but I still don't always hear elected officials really draw that line. And that may start to change as these impacts get more dire, and that may start to trickle into policy. But we'll have to see the extent to which that actually happens.
Yeah, I might have to echo a lot of what Emily said, but one thing I'll say is that farmers have always been experts on climate. And whether people in, cities like Atlanta and Savannah often remember it, a lot of Georgia is farms, and a ton of our representatives are farmers. But like Emily said, there's still a pretty firm disconnect between broader climate-related policies and the people who are feeling it. We see increased budgeting to the Department of Agriculture, and I think we'll see efforts to make sure farmers have, water access and access to funds and supplies they need to farm and recover from climate disasters like the hurricanes that we saw in South Georgia last year. But there's still this tension with our best in business practices and the environment those farmers rely on. How we permit these big businesses, whether it's industrial facilities or data centers, directly will impact farmers like our representatives. Are we being aggressive about greenhouse gas reduction goals? Are we permitting air pollution permits and water withdrawals with future farmers in rural communities in mind? And I think that is really where the rubber is going to meet the road in the future.
Something I've been thinking a lot about lately, I imagine politics covering climate and the environment can be a little depressing or discouraging sometimes. And I wonder if you can each share a nugget from your reporting that points to solutions or maybe gives you reason for optimism about the future.
Absolutely. And this is something that every environmental journalism job, when they interview, they ask about. But I will say that this might sound a little counterintuitive, but one of the things I've recently found some optimism in has been repetition. I've had sources, these people who are really jazzed about innovative solutions from totally separate corners of environment-related studies point out similar methods like strategically planting trees or building stormwater retention parks and other green infrastructure solutions that have a lot of co-benefits that do a lot to impact each other's work. That means that we have a good idea of a few specific things that can make dents on a ton of different problems, from air quality and public health to flooding, and we can do them all at the same time. So that's really exciting.
I think my answer is actually a little similar, which is that we really are now at a point where we have solutions. Years ago, we used to hear so much about needing new tech or someday this brand new expensive thing will be a viable solution. But we're now at a point where, electricity that's made with solar panels is cheaper than electricity made with gas. We have electric cars at a range of different price points. There's all of the sort of green infrastructure Marisa was talking about. There's a lot of other solutions that if I describe them, they don't really sound sexy or fun, but they're proven. They work. They can reduce emissions and improve the environment. They do exist. We just have to actually do them. And that's a really exciting place to be in. There is still a long way to go. But I think, like you said, people can get pretty despondent about the climate crisis sometimes, thinking that there's not really a way out. And in reality, there is a way out. There are plenty of very real, very feasible steps that we can take. And that to me feels like a really hopeful place to be.
That's the voice of Emily Jones along with Marisa Mecke. They are the ones who bring us our amazing environment and climate coverage here on WABE. Thank you so much for joining us on the show. And I look forward to doing the podcast in the Okefenokee, maybe?
Yeah.
Maybe not. I don't know.
Let's make it happen.
Yes, please. Thanks for having us.
That's it for this week. Dome Scramble is a production of the WABE Politics team. Our producer is Brendan Rivers, and our managing editor is Alex Helmick.
And you can get more Georgia politics every Tuesday and Thursday with the Political Breakfast podcast. And check out WABE.org/Under the Gold Dome. We'll be back next week.
Ever wondered where to find the best dumplings in town? Curious about Atlanta's obsession with lemon pepper? Join us on Savory Stories, a new podcast as we uncover the untold tales behind Atlanta's culinary scene. From the roots of your favorite dishes to the creators that bring them to life, we're diving deep into the heart of the city's food culture. Listen to Savory Stories at wabe.org/podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts.
WABE.
Hey y'all, I'm Mark Kendall.
And I'm David Perdue.
And we're the hosts of What's Good Atlanta, the new weekly comedy podcast from WABE.
On What's Good Atlanta, we run down uplifting and unusual headlines from the universe known as Atlanta.
And while we may not be journalists, we are comedians, and we'll be breaking down news and breaking down the stories that make you smile.
We're just trying to see what's good, Atlanta.
Episodes drop Fridays at WABE.org or wherever you get your podcasts. I get mine from a guy named Craig.
Shout out to Craig.
WABE.